Dr. Marcus Thompson had always believed that some moments in life choose you, rather than the other way around. Standing at the edge of the Kenyan savannah, on that scorching afternoon in March, watching the golden grasslands stretch endlessly toward the horizon, he had no idea that such a moment was about to find him. Marcus was a wildlife veterinarian from Colorado who had dedicated his life to saving animals. At 42 years old, he had spent the last 15 years traveling to remote corners of the world, treating everything from injured elephants in Thailand to sick polar bears in Alaska. His weathered hands told stories of countless rescues, and his gentle eyes held the wisdom that comes from understanding that every life, no matter how small or fierce, mattered deeply. The Masai Mara National Reserve had called him 3 weeks earlier. Reports were coming in about a pride of lions that seemed to be struggling. Several members appeared sick, and the local rangers were concerned about a possible disease outbreak that could devastate the lion population in the area. Marcus had immediately packed his equipment and boarded the first flight to Nairobi. Working alongside Dr. Amara Kiplimo, a brilliant Kenyan wildlife biologist, Marcus had been tracking this particular pride for 2 weeks. The pride consisted of 12 lions, 3 adult males, 4 females, and 5 cubs of various ages. What made this group special was their matriarch, a magnificent lioness named Sahara by the local Maasai people. She was estimated to be around 8 years old, which made her middle-aged in lion years, and she had successfully raised 3 litters of cubs. Sahara was different from other lionesses Marcus had encountered. She possessed an almost regal bearing, with intelligent amber eyes that seemed to assess everything around her with careful consideration. The Maasai elders spoke of her with reverence, claiming she was blessed by the spirits of their ancestors. Whether or not one believed in such things, there was something undeniably special about this lioness. For the past week, Marcus and Amara had noticed that Sahara was behaving strangely. She had separated herself from the pride, which was unusual behavior for a lioness. She was spending long periods lying in the shade of a large acacia tree, about 200 meters from where the rest of the pride typically gathered. Her appetite had decreased and she seemed restless, often getting up and pacing in small circles before lying down again. Marcus had been observing animals long enough to recognize the signs. Sahara was pregnant, and from her behavior, he suspected she was very close to giving birth. This should have been a joyful occasion, as lion cubs were always a precious addition to any pride. However, something was wrong. Sahara's breathing appeared labored, and through his binoculars, Marcus could see that she was in distress. On this particular afternoon, Marcus and Amara had positioned themselves about 50 meters away from Sahara's chosen spot, using a rocky outcropping as cover. They had been watching for 3 hours when Sahara's behavior suddenly changed dramatically. She began pacing frantically, pausing frequently to look back at her flanks. She would lie down for a few minutes, then immediately stand up again, clearly agitated. "She's going into labor," Amara whispered, adjusting her binoculars. "But something's not right. Look at how she's positioning herself." Marcus focused his attention on the lioness. In normal circumstances, a lioness in labor would find a secluded den or thick brush where she could give birth safely, hidden from predators and other threats. Sahara, however, was in an exposed area with minimal cover. More concerning was the way she kept trying to lie down but couldn't seem to find a comfortable position. As the afternoon wore on, Sahara's distress became more apparent. She was now breathing heavily, her sides heaving with each breath. Marcus could see her straining, but no cubs appeared. Hours passed, and it became clear that she was experiencing complications. "This isn't normal," Marcus said quietly to Amara. "She should have given birth by now. I think she's having difficulty delivering." Amara nodded grimly. "Dystocia. It's rare in wild lions, but it happens. Without intervention, both the mother and cubs could die." The situation presented an enormous dilemma. In the wild, nature typically took its course, and interference from humans was generally discouraged. The natural order had its own way of maintaining balance, and wildlife veterinarians were trained to observe and document rather than intervene in most situations. However, this was not just any lioness. Sahara was the matriarch of this pride, and her death would likely mean the end of the entire family unit. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Sahara's condition continued to deteriorate. She was now lying on her side, barely moving except for the occasional spasm that racked her body. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. "I have to help her," he said, beginning to gather his medical equipment from their vehicle. Amara grabbed his arm. "Marcus, you can't be serious. She's a wild lioness. Even in distress, she could kill you without thinking twice. And what about the rest of the pride? The males won't let you anywhere near her." Marcus looked toward the pride, which had been keeping their distance from Sahara, but were clearly aware of her situation. The 3 males were restless, pacing and occasionally roaring their concern. The other females were equally agitated, some approaching Sahara before backing away again, sensing that something was terribly wrong. "If I don't try, she'll die," Marcus said simply, "and those cubs will die with her. I didn't become a veterinarian to stand by and watch when I know I can help." The decision was not made lightly. Marcus understood the risks better than anyone. He had been charged by a wounded buffalo in Tanzania and had narrowly escaped an attack by a protective mother elephant in Botswana. He knew that approaching a lioness, especially one in labor, was potentially suicidal. But something deep inside him, the same instinct that had driven him to become a wildlife veterinarian in the first place, told him that this was a moment when he had to act. As darkness began to fall over the savannah, Marcus began to formulate a plan that would either save Sahara and her cubs or cost him everything he had ever worked for, including possibly his life. The first step in Marcus's plan was to separate Sahara from the rest of the pride. As long as the other lions remained nearby, any attempt to approach her would likely result in a protective attack from the males. Lions are fiercely protective of their family members, and the males would see Marcus as a threat to be eliminated. Working quickly in the fading light, Marcus and Amara developed a strategy. They would use their vehicle to create a barrier between Sahara and the pride, then use sound and movement to encourage the other lions to move away temporarily. It was dangerous and unconventional, but it was their only chance. Amara drove their Land Rover in a wide arc around the area, positioning it between Sahara and the pride. Marcus had loaded a tranquilizer gun with a mild sedative, not enough to knock Sahara unconscious, but sufficient to calm her enough that he could examine her safely. The dose was critical. Too much could harm both the mother and her unborn cubs. Too little would be ineffective. As they implemented their plan, the pride became increasingly agitated. The 3 males began to pace more aggressively, their roars echoing across the savannah. One of the largest males, a magnificent specimen with a full dark mane, started moving toward their vehicle. Marcus knew they had only minutes before the situation became too dangerous to continue. Now or never, Marcus whispered to himself as he stepped out of the vehicle. The walk from the Land Rover to where Sahara lay was only about 30 meters, but it felt like the longest journey of Marcus's life. Every step brought him closer to one of nature's most formidable predators. His heart pounded so loudly he was certain the lioness could hear it. Sahara's golden eyes tracked his movement as he approached. She was clearly exhausted from hours of labor, but her instincts remained sharp. A low growl rumbled from her throat, a warning that Marcus was getting too close. He stopped about 10 meters away and slowly knelt down, making himself less threatening, while still maintaining enough distance to escape if necessary. For several long minutes, man and lioness simply observed each other. Marcus spoke in soft, gentle tones, the same voice he used with frightened animals in his clinic back in Colorado. He had learned over the years that animals could sense intention, and despite their inability to understand words, they often responded to the emotional tone behind them. "I know you're scared, girl," Marcus said quietly. "I know you're in pain. I want to help you and your babies." Sahara's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. Her breathing was becoming more labored, and Marcus could see that she was weakening. Time was running out for both mother and cubs. Moving slowly and deliberately, Marcus raised the tranquilizer gun. The dart was small and would cause minimal discomfort, but he needed to place it precisely in the muscle of her hind leg. One sudden movement from Sahara could turn this rescue attempt into a disaster. The dart found its mark with a soft thud. Sahara startled and attempted to stand, but the exhaustion from her prolonged labor worked in Marcus's favor. Within minutes, the mild sedative began to take effect. Her movements became sluggish, though she remained conscious and aware. Marcus waited another 5 minutes before slowly approaching. This was the most dangerous moment of all. Even sedated, a lioness retained enough strength to deliver a fatal blow. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready to leap backward at the first sign of aggression. When he finally reached Sahara's side, Marcus was amazed by her size and power. Up close, she was even more magnificent than he had imagined. Her golden coat was thick and healthy, and despite her current distress, she radiated the kind of wild beauty that could only be found in nature's most perfect creations. Working quickly but gently, Marcus began his examination. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. The first cub was positioned incorrectly in the birth canal, what veterinarians call a breech presentation. The cub's hind legs were coming first instead of the head, and it had become lodged in position. Without immediate intervention, both the cub and mother would die. Marcus had performed this type of emergency procedure on domestic animals countless times, but never on a wild lioness in the middle of the African savanna. The techniques were the same, but everything else about the situation was unprecedented. Using sterile gloves and lubricant from his emergency kit, Marcus began the delicate process of repositioning the cub. Sahara groaned softly but remained still, as if she somehow understood that this strange human was trying to help her. The trust she was showing was extraordinary, defying everything Marcus knew about wild animal behavior. The work was painstakingly slow. Marcus had to be extremely careful not to injure either the mother or the cub during the repositioning process. Sweat dripped from his forehead despite the cool evening air. In the distance, he could hear the concerned roars of the pride, and Amara's voice calling updates about their location. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Marcus felt the cub shift into the correct position. "Come on, little one," he whispered. "Time to meet the world." With gentle assistance from Marcus, Sahara's natural contractions finally began to move the cub toward birth. The lioness seemed to understand what was happening and began to push with renewed strength. The first cub emerged into the world just as the last light of day disappeared completely. It was a male, small but perfectly formed, with the characteristic spotted coat of a newborn lion. Marcus quickly cleared the birth canal and stimulated the cub's breathing. Within seconds, the little lion was mewing softly and attempting to move toward his mother, but Marcus's work was far from over. His examination had revealed that there were at least 2 more cubs waiting to be born, and there was no guarantee that they would present correctly, or that Sahara would have the strength to deliver them after her prolonged ordeal. As the African night settled around them, illuminated only by the stars and a half-moon, Marcus prepared for what could be the longest and most challenging night of his career. In the distance, hyenas called to each other, reminding him that the savannah held many dangers for a human working alone with a vulnerable lioness and her newborn cubs. The success of the first birth had given him hope, but Marcus knew that the greatest challenges still lay ahead. The night was young, and there were still lives hanging in the balance. The second cub arrived much easier than the first, sliding into the world with Sahara's natural contractions doing most of the work. This one was a female, slightly larger than her brother, with the same beautiful spotted coat that would eventually transform into the golden fur of an adult lioness. Marcus watched with amazement as Sahara immediately began cleaning her cubs with her rough tongue, the universal language of motherhood transcending species. However, Marcus's relief was short-lived. During his initial examination, he had felt what seemed to be a third cub, but something was wrong. Sahara continued to show signs of labor, straining and panting, but no third cub appeared. As minutes turned into an hour, Marcus realized they were facing another complication. Using his portable ultrasound device, a piece of equipment he always carried for field work, Marcus confirmed his suspicions. There was indeed a third cub, but this one was significantly smaller than the others and appeared to be in distress. The umbilical cord seemed to be wrapped around the cub's neck, cutting off vital blood flow. This was an emergency within an emergency. The third cub needed to be delivered immediately, or it would not survive. But the procedure would be even more delicate than the first intervention, requiring Marcus to reach further into the birth canal while trying not to injure Sahara or tighten the cord around the cub's neck. Working by the light of a powerful flashlight held by Amara, who had joined him when it became clear that the situation was stable enough for her to approach, Marcus began the most challenging procedure of his career. His hands, steady from years of practice, worked carefully to locate the umbilical cord and create enough slack to slip it over the cub's head. Sahara seemed to understand the urgency of the situation. Despite the discomfort, she remained remarkably still, occasionally lifting her head to check on her two newborn cubs, but otherwise allowing Marcus to work. The trust between human and wild animal was something that neither Marcus nor Amara had ever witnessed before. "I can feel the cord," Marcus whispered to Amara. "It's wrapped twice around the neck. I need to be very careful here." The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Marcus worked millimeter by millimeter, using his fingers to feel his way around the tiny cub's neck. One wrong move could tighten the cord further or worse, injure the delicate structures of either mother or baby. Finally, Marcus felt the cord give way. "Got it," he breathed. Almost immediately, Sahara's contractions resumed with renewed strength, and within minutes, the third cub was born. This cub was noticeably smaller than the other two, and initially appeared lifeless. Marcus immediately began emergency resuscitation, gently clearing the airways and stimulating breathing. For several terrifying moments, the tiny lion remained motionless. "Come on, baby," Marcus pleaded, continuing his efforts. "Don't give up now." Just when he was beginning to fear the worst, the little cub suddenly gasped and let out a weak but unmistakable mew. Marcus felt tears of relief stream down his face as he carefully placed the third cub next to its siblings. Sahara immediately began cleaning her smallest baby with extra attention, as if she too understood how close they had come to losing this precious life. The three cubs, though exhausted from their dramatic entrance into the world, began the instinctive search for their mother's milk. But Marcus's night was far from over. Newborn lion cubs are incredibly vulnerable, and the next few hours would be critical for their survival. They needed to nurse successfully to receive the vital antibodies in their mother's first milk, and their body temperature needed to be maintained in the cool night air. As if the challenges weren't already enormous, the sounds of the night began to change around them. The distant whooping calls of hyenas were getting closer, and Marcus knew that the smell of birth and blood would attract every scavenger in the area. Hyenas were notorious for stealing lion cubs when the opportunity presented itself. "We need to get them to safety," Amara said, voicing what Marcus was already thinking. The pride had remained at a distance throughout the birth process, kept away by the presence of the humans and the bright lights they were using. But now Marcus could see the glowing eyes of the three males reflecting in the darkness much closer than before. They were becoming restless, torn between their desire to protect Sahara and their instinctive fear of humans. Marcus made another difficult decision. Rather than retreat and leave Sahara vulnerable with her newborns, he chose to stay through the night to monitor the cubs and protect the small family from potential threats. It was dangerous keeping them in close proximity to wild predators for extended periods, but leaving felt even more risky. He and Amara took turns keeping watch, one always awake while the other rested. The Land Rover provided some protection, and they kept a small fire burning to deter curious hyenas and other nocturnal predators. Throughout the night, Marcus monitored Sahara and her cubs. The lioness was clearly exhausted but alert, her maternal instincts fully engaged. She carefully positioned herself to keep her babies warm, and constantly checked on each one. The cubs, despite their traumatic birth, seemed to be thriving. All three were nursing successfully, and their tiny mews filled the air. As dawn began to break over the savannah, painting the sky in soft pastels of pink and gold, Marcus allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic. Sahara was showing no signs of post-birth complications, and all three cubs appeared healthy and active. The approaching daylight brought a new concern, however. With sunrise would come increased activity from all the predators and scavengers in the area. Lions, hyenas, leopards, and even wild dogs would be on the move, and a lioness with newborn cubs would be seen as both a threat and an opportunity by various species. More importantly, the rest of Sahara's pride was becoming increasingly agitated as the night wore on. The males were pacing more frequently, and their roars were becoming more frequent and aggressive. Marcus knew that soon the pride's patience would run out, and they would attempt to reclaim their matriarch and her new cubs. The question now was whether Sahara and her babies were strong enough to rejoin the pride safely, or whether they needed more time to recover from the night's ordeal. It was a decision that would determine not just the immediate safety of the cubs, but their long-term survival in the harsh world of the African wilderness. As the sun rose higher, Marcus prepared for the most challenging part of his rescue mission, ensuring that his intervention had truly saved lives, rather than simply postponing the inevitable. The morning sun brought both relief and new challenges. Sahara appeared to be recovering well from the birth, but Marcus could see that she was still weak from the prolonged labor and the stress of the night. The cubs, however, were showing remarkable resilience. All three were nursing regularly, and their movements were becoming stronger and more coordinated with each passing hour. Marcus knew that they couldn't maintain this artificial separation between Sahara and her pride much longer. Lions are social animals, and the cubs would need the protection and support of the entire pride to survive in the wild. But the integration needed to happen carefully and at the right time. The largest of the three males, the one Marcus had dubbed Mfalme, meaning king in Swahili, was becoming increasingly bold in his attempts to approach. He would venture closer to their position, stop about 20 meters away, and let out powerful roars that seemed to be calling to Sahara. The lioness would respond with softer vocalizations, clearly communicating with her pride leader but not yet ready to move. "She knows she's not strong enough yet," Amara observed, watching the interaction between the separated lions, "but he's getting impatient." Marcus made the decision to begin gradually reducing their protective presence. First, he extinguished the fire that had been keeping scavengers at bay throughout the night. Then he slowly moved their equipment farther from Sahara's resting spot, giving the pride an opportunity to approach if they chose to. What happened next was something that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. Instead of the aggressive approach he had expected, Mfalme moved toward Sahara with remarkable gentleness. The massive lion, who could easily weigh over 400 pounds, approached the new mother with careful, measured steps. When he reached her side, he gently touched her head with his own, in what could only be described as a tender greeting. The reunion between Sahara and her pride was unlike anything Marcus had read about in wildlife behavior studies. One by one, the other pride members approached to investigate the new cubs. The other females were especially gentle, sniffing carefully at each newborn and making soft vocalizations that seemed to welcome them to the family. Most surprising was the behavior of the other cubs in the pride, ranging in age from 6 months to nearly 2 years old. Rather than showing jealousy or aggression toward the newcomers, they seemed curious and protective. The older cubs formed a loose circle around Sahara and her babies, creating an additional barrier of protection. Marcus and Amara watched this reunion from a respectful distance, documenting everything with cameras and careful notes. What they were witnessing was rare lion behavior that few people had ever observed in the wild. "This is extraordinary," Amara whispered, adjusting her camera settings to capture the morning light on the pride. "I've studied lion behavior for 12 years, and I've never seen integration happen this smoothly." As the morning progressed, it became clear that Sahara's cubs were being fully accepted by the pride. Marcus began to allow himself to believe that his risky intervention had been successful. The 3 cubs he had helped bring into the world were not just alive, but thriving in their natural family structure. However, nature had one more test in store for the little family. Around midday, as the pride was resting in the shade of their favorite acacia trees, a group of 4 spotted hyenas appeared on a ridge about 200 meters away. Hyenas are notorious for their intelligence and their willingness to challenge lions for food or territory. More concerning, they have been known to target vulnerable lion cubs when the opportunity presents itself. The hyenas seemed to sense that something was different about this pride. They moved closer, their distinctive sloping gait bringing them to within 50 meters of the lions. Marcus could see them testing the air, trying to pick up scents that would tell them more about the situation. The pride's response was immediate and coordinated. The 3 males positioned themselves between the hyenas and Sahara's location, while the other females moved closer to the new mother and her cubs. Even the older cubs seemed to understand the threat, moving to form a protective circle. Marcus felt his heart rate increase as he watched the standoff develop. After everything they had been through, the thought of losing the cubs to hyenas was almost unbearable. He reached for his tranquilizer gun, though he knew that interfering now could disrupt the natural order and potentially make the situation worse. The largest hyena, clearly the leader of their clan, made a tentative approach toward the lions. Falme's response was swift and decisive. The magnificent lion charged forward with a roar that echoed across the savannah, his mane flowing behind him like a battle standard. The hyena immediately retreated but didn't flee entirely. For several tense minutes, The two groups faced each other in a primal standoff that had been played out on the African plains for thousands of years. The hyenas chattered and whooped among themselves, while the lions maintained their defensive positions with low growls and twitching tails. Finally, perhaps sensing that this pride was too strong and well-organized to challenge successfully, the hyenas began to retreat. They moved slowly at first, maintaining their dignity, but eventually trotted away toward another part of their territory. The crisis had passed, but it served as a reminder to Marcus of how precarious life could be for young lions, even with the protection of a strong pride. The cubs he had helped deliver were beginning a lifelong struggle for survival in one of nature's most challenging environments. As the afternoon heat reached its peak, the pride settled into their typical midday rest pattern. Sahara found a comfortable spot in the shade where she could nurse her cubs while still maintaining visual contact with the rest of the pride. The three newborns were already showing distinct personalities. The firstborn male was bold and active, constantly trying to explore beyond his mother's immediate vicinity. The female was calmer but alert, seeming to observe everything around her with intelligent eyes. The smallest cub, the one who had nearly died at birth, was the most cautious but also appeared to be the most determined to keep up with his larger siblings. Marcus realized that his time with this remarkable family was drawing to a close. The cubs were healthy, the pride was unified, and nature was ready to take over the responsibilities that he had temporarily assumed. But as he packed his equipment and prepared to leave, Marcus knew that this experience had changed him fundamentally. He had not just saved 3 lion cubs. He had been privileged to witness one of nature's most profound mysteries. The moment when life triumphs over death through the combination of natural instinct and human compassion. The story of Sahara and her cubs was far from over, but Marcus's part in it was nearly complete. What remained was the most difficult part of any wildlife intervention, stepping back and allowing nature to determine the ultimate outcome. 3 days after the birth, Marcus made the difficult decision to begin withdrawing from active observation of Sahara and her cubs. The family had successfully integrated with the pride, and all 3 cubs were nursing well and gaining strength. However, leaving felt like abandoning his own children, and Marcus found himself struggling with emotions he hadn't expected. On their final morning of close observation, something remarkable happened that would become the most talked about moment of Marcus's career. As he and Amara were packing their equipment, preparing to move to a more distant observation post, Sahara did something unprecedented. The lioness, who had been resting with her cubs about 30 meters away, suddenly stood up and began walking directly toward Marcus. This was completely contrary to normal lion behavior, especially for a mother with newborn cubs. Wild lions, even those that have had positive interactions with humans, typically maintain their distance once the immediate crisis has passed. "Marcus," Amara whispered urgently. "She's coming straight at us. What should we do?" Marcus felt his heart pounding, but something in Sahara's demeanor told him this wasn't an aggressive approach. Her ears were forward in a relaxed position. Her tail was low and still, and her movements were calm and deliberate. Still, she was a powerful predator, and Marcus knew that even friendly interactions with wild lions could turn dangerous in seconds. "Stay calm," Marcus whispered back. "Let's see what she wants." Sahara approached to within 10 meters of where Marcus stood, closer than any wild lion had ever voluntarily come to him. She stopped and sat down in a position that reminded Marcus of a domestic cat seeking attention. For several long moments, the lioness and the veterinarian simply looked at each other. Then Sahara did something that brought tears to Marcus's eyes. She made a soft vocalization, similar to the chuffing sound that lions use to greet family members, and slowly blinked her amber eyes. In the animal world, the slow blink is often considered a sign of trust and affection. It was as if she was saying goodbye and thank you in the only way she could. "She's thanking you," Amara breathed, her own eyes filling with tears. "I've never seen anything like this." After several minutes of this extraordinary communication, Sahara stood up, gave Marcus one last long look, and returned to her cubs. She gathered them close to her and led them toward the main pride, which had been watching the entire interaction from a respectful distance. Marcus stood there, overwhelmed by the realization that he had just experienced something that might happen once in a lifetime. The connection he had felt with Sahara during the birth had been real, and she had acknowledged it in a way that transcended the normal boundaries between human and wild animal. The days that followed were both satisfying and challenging for Marcus. He and Amara established a long-distance observation post about half a kilometer from the pride's territory, where they could monitor the cubs' progress without interfering in their natural development. Through powerful binoculars and telephoto camera lenses, they watched as the 3 cubs grew stronger and more adventurous each day. The firstborn male, whom Marcus privately called Simba, was living up to his bold nature. By the end of the first week, he was already venturing several meters from his mother's side, exploring his environment with typical cat curiosity. The female, whom Marcus thought of as Nuru, meaning light in Swahili, was more reserved, but seemed to be the most intelligent of the 3, often watching and learning from the older cubs before attempting new behaviors herself. The smallest cub, the one who had nearly died at birth, presented both the greatest challenges and the most heartwarming moments. Marcus called him Jasiri, meaning brave, because despite his small size, he showed remarkable determination to keep up with his larger siblings. There were moments when Marcus worried about Jasiri's ability to compete for nursing opportunities or keep up with the pride's movements. But the little lion consistently surprised everyone with his resilience. What touched Marcus most deeply was observing how the entire pride had adjusted their behavior to accommodate the 3 newcomers. The older cubs were remarkably gentle with their new siblings, often allowing them to share food and even playing with them in carefully controlled ways that wouldn't hurt the smaller babies. The adult females, including Sahara's sisters and cousins, took turns helping to watch over the cubs when Sahara needed to hunt or rest. This communal child-rearing is typical of lion prides, but Marcus was amazed by how seamlessly his 3 rescued cubs had been incorporated into the existing family structure. Most impressively, the 3 males showed unprecedented tolerance for the cubs' behavior. Young lions are naturally playful and often fearless, which can sometimes irritate adult males. However, Mfalme and his companions seemed to understand that these particular cubs had been through something special, and they showed remarkable patience when the little ones climbed on them or interrupted their rest. As the second week progressed, Marcus began to receive messages from the international wildlife community about his intervention. Word had spread through scientific networks about the successful delivery of cubs from a wild lioness, and researchers from around the world were expressing both admiration and concern about the precedent it might set. Some colleagues argued that Marcus had violated fundamental principles of wildlife management by interfering in natural processes. They worried that his actions might encourage other well-meaning but less experienced people to attempt similar interventions, potentially causing more harm than good. Others praised his decision, pointing out that human activities had already significantly impacted lion populations across Africa, and that occasional intervention to save individual animals was not only justified, but necessary for conservation efforts. Marcus found himself caught in an ethical debate that he hadn't fully anticipated. While he was absolutely certain that saving Sahara and her cubs had been the right decision, he also understood the concerns of those who questioned his actions. The debate took on new dimensions when international media outlets began picking up the story. Within days, Marcus found himself fielding interview requests from television networks, newspapers, and wildlife magazines around the world. The story of the veterinarian who risked everything to save a lioness and her cubs captured public imagination in ways that surprised everyone involved. However, Marcus was determined not to let the media attention overshadow the most important aspect of the story: the ongoing survival and development of the 3 cubs he had helped bring into the world. Every morning, he and Amara continued their observations, documenting the cubs' progress and ensuring that they were continuing to thrive in their natural environment. As the 3rd week began, Marcus realized that the time was approaching when he would need to leave Kenya and return to his regular practice in Colorado. The thought of leaving Sahara and her cubs was emotionally difficult, but he knew that his continued presence was no longer necessary for their survival. The cubs were growing rapidly, their eyes had opened fully, and they were beginning to explore their world with increasing confidence. Most importantly, they had been completely accepted by their pride and were developing the social bonds that would be crucial for their survival as adult lions. But before Marcus could leave, nature had one final surprise in store that would test everything he had worked to achieve. On Marcus's planned final day of observation, a severe drought that had been building across the region finally reached its peak. The small watering holes that the Pride depended on had dried up completely, forcing them to make a dangerous journey to the main river, nearly 15 kilometers away. For adult lions, this was a challenging but manageable trek. For 3-week-old cubs, it could be a death sentence. Marcus watched through his binoculars as the Pride gathered in the early morning hours, clearly preparing for the long journey. Sahara seemed torn between her maternal instincts to protect her cubs and her knowledge that staying near the dried watering holes meant certain death. For the entire Pride, the decision of what to do with the cubs fell to the Pride as a whole, and Marcus witnessed a remarkable display of animal intelligence and cooperation. The adults formed a circle around Sahara and her babies, clearly discussing their options through vocalizations and body language that Marcus was only beginning to understand. After nearly an hour of this deliberation, the Pride reached a decision that surprised Marcus. Rather than attempting to carry the cubs the entire distance, they would make the journey in stages, with some adults remaining behind to protect the cubs while others scouted ahead and established temporary resting spots. Mfalmi and one of the other males set out first, their mission to ensure the route was safe and to locate suitable resting places along the way. The remaining adults organized themselves into a protective formation around Sahara and the cubs, with the older juveniles forming an outer perimeter. Marcus made a decision that went against every protocol he had ever learned about wildlife observation. He and Amara decided to follow the Pride's journey at a discreet distance, ready to intervene if the cubs encountered difficulties that threatened their survival. "This goes against everything we're supposed to do," Amara said as they loaded emergency supplies into their Land Rover. "So did everything else we've done in the past 3 weeks," Marcus replied. "I'm not going to abandon them now." The journey began in the cool hours just after dawn. Sahara carried each of her cubs in turn, grasping them gently by the scruff of the neck as domestic cats do with their kittens. The cubs seemed to understand instinctively that they needed to remain still during transport, hanging limply from their mother's jaws in complete trust. The first several kilometers went smoothly. The Pride moved at a slow, steady pace, with frequent rest stops to allow Sahara to nurse the cubs and for everyone to conserve energy. Marcus was amazed by the organizational skills the lions displayed, with different adults taking turns scouting ahead, while others maintained security around the main group. However, as the day grew hotter and the terrain became more challenging, the cubs began to show signs of stress. Simba, despite his bold nature, was becoming lethargic from the heat. Nuru was panting heavily, and little Jasiri seemed to be struggling more than his siblings. It was during the hottest part of the day, when the Pride had taken shelter under a large baobab tree, that disaster nearly struck. A group of wild dogs, one of Africa's most efficient pack hunters, appeared on a ridge overlooking the Pride's resting spot. Wild dogs are smaller than lions but hunt in coordinated packs that can bring down prey much larger than themselves. More importantly for the current situation, they are known to target young and vulnerable animals when the opportunity presents itself. The Pride's response was immediate, but complicated by their current circumstances. They needed to protect the cubs, but they also couldn't afford to engage in a prolonged fight when they were already stressed by the journey and the drought. Marcus watched in fascination and terror as the lions implemented a strategy he had never seen before. Instead of charging the wild dogs directly, they used a coordinated deception. Several adults, led by one of the males, moved away from the tree in an apparent retreat, making themselves visible to the wild dogs while carefully leading them away from the cubs' location. Meanwhile, Sahara and the remaining adults formed a tight defensive circle around the 3 babies. The older cubs were positioned in the center of this circle, adding their small but determined presence to the defense. The wild dogs, seeing what appeared to be a weakened Pride in retreat, began to follow the decoy group. But the pack leader, more experienced than the others, seemed to sense that something was wrong. Instead of following his packmates, he began moving toward the baobab tree where the cubs were hidden. This was the moment when Marcus faced his most difficult decision of the entire experience. Every instinct told him to intervene, to protect the cubs he had helped bring into the world. But he also knew that constant human intervention would ultimately harm the cubs' chances of survival in the wild. As the wild dog crept closer to the defensive circle around the cubs, Marcus reached for his tranquilizer gun. But before he could act, something extraordinary happened that would change his understanding of lion behavior forever. Sahara, the lioness he had helped through the most difficult night of her life, stepped forward from the defensive circle. She didn't charge or roar. Instead, she simply walked calmly toward the approaching wild dog and sat down about 10 meters away from him. The wild dog stopped, clearly confused by this behavior. In his experience, lions either fled or attacked. This calm, confident approach was something entirely new. For several long moments, Sahara and the wild dog simply looked at each other. Then Sahara did something that Marcus would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. She made the same soft vocalization that she had used when saying goodbye to Marcus 3 weeks earlier, followed by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to carry a message. The wild dog's ears flicked forward, then back. He took a step toward Sahara, then stopped. Something in her demeanor, some quality that Marcus couldn't identify, was communicating a message that transcended species. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the wild dog slowly backed away. He rejoined his pack, which had been unsuccessful in their pursuit of the decoy lions, and the entire group disappeared over the ridge. The crisis had passed without violence, without intervention, and without loss of life. Sahara had somehow communicated to a natural enemy that her cubs were under special protection, and that protection had been respected. As the sun began to set, the pride resumed their journey. The cubs, refreshed by their long rest and successful nursing session, seemed ready for the final push to the river. Marcus and Amara followed at a distance, now more convinced than ever that they were observing something truly special. The pride reached the river just as the last light was fading from the sky. The cubs had their first taste of abundant fresh water, and Sahara was able to drink deeply for the first time in days. The adults began hunting almost immediately, knowing that the cubs would need rich milk to continue growing strong. Marcus realized that his time with this remarkable family had truly come to an end. The cubs were now 3 weeks old, healthy, and fully integrated into a pride that had shown extraordinary adaptability and intelligence. They had survived their birth, their first days of life, and their first major journey. They were ready to face the challenges of growing up wild. As Marcus prepared for his final departure, Sahara once again approached him. This time, she brought all 3 cubs with her, carrying them one by one to a spot where Marcus could see them clearly. It was as if she wanted him to have one last look at the lives he had helped save. Simba was now clearly the largest and most adventurous of the 3. Nuru had developed into a thoughtful, observant cub who seemed to learn quickly from everything around her. And Jasiri, despite his small size, had proven himself to be the most determined and resilient of the group. As Marcus watched them playing together by the riverbank, he realized that he had not just saved 3 lion cubs. He had participated in something much larger, the continuation of an ancient lineage, the preservation of wild places, and the demonstration that sometimes, when approached with respect and humility, the boundaries between human and wild can be crossed for the greater good. 6 months later, Marcus received a message from Amara with photos of the 3 cubs, now growing into strong young lions. Simba was developing into a confident young male with the beginnings of a mane. Nuru had become one of the most skilled hunters among the younger lions in the pride. And Jasiri, still the smallest of the 3, had earned the respect of the entire pride through his courage and determination. The story of the man who risked everything for a lioness in labor had become legend among the Maasai people, who spoke of it as proof that sometimes the spirits choose certain humans to serve as guardians of the wild. Marcus never claimed any spiritual significance for his actions, but he couldn't deny that the experience had changed him in ways that went far beyond his professional knowledge. Years later, when people asked Marcus why he had taken such enormous risks for 3 lion cubs, his answer was always the same: because in that moment there was no choice to make. There was only life that needed saving, and the knowledge that I could help save it. The 3 cubs lived to adulthood, successfully reproducing and adding their own offspring to the pride. Sahara lived to see her grandchildren born, and the genetic line that Marcus had helped preserve continued to thrive in the wild places of Kenya. But perhaps the most importantly for the current situation, They are known to target young and vulnerable animals when the opportunity presents itself. The pride's response was immediate, but complicated by their current circumstances. They needed to protect the cubs, but they also couldn't afford to engage in a prolonged fight when they were already stressed by the journey and the drought. Marcus watched in fascination and terror as the lions implemented a strategy he had never seen before. Instead of charging the wild dogs directly, they used a coordinated deception. Several adults, led by one of the males, moved away from the tree in an apparent retreat, making themselves visible to the wild dogs while carefully leading them away from the cubs' location. Meanwhile, Sahara and the remaining adults formed a tight defensive circle around the three babies. The older cubs were positioned in the center of this circle, adding their small but determined presence to the defense. The wild dogs, seeing what appeared to be a weakened pride in retreat, began to follow the decoy group. But the pack leader, more experienced than the others, seemed to sense that something was wrong. Instead of following his packmates, he began moving toward the baobab tree where the cubs were hidden. This was the moment when Marcus faced his most difficult decision of the entire experience. Every instinct told him to intervene, to protect the cubs he had helped bring into the world. But he also knew that constant human intervention would ultimately harm the cubs' chances of survival in the wild. As the wild dog crept closer to the defensive circle around the cubs, Marcus reached for his tranquilizer gun. But before he could act, something extraordinary happened that would change his understanding of lion behavior forever. Sahara, the lioness he had helped through the most difficult night of her life, stepped forward from the defensive circle. She didn't charge or roar. Instead, she simply walked calmly toward the approaching wild dog and sat down about 10 meters away from him. The wild dog stopped, clearly confused by this behavior. In his experience, lions either fled or attacked. This calm, confident approach was something entirely new. For several long moments, Sahara and the wild dog simply looked at each other. Then Sahara did something that Marcus would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. She made the same soft vocalization that she had used when saying goodbye to Marcus 3 weeks earlier, followed by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to carry a message. The wild dog's ears flicked forward, then back. He took a step toward Sahara, then stopped. Something in her demeanor, some quality that Marcus couldn't identify, was communicating a message that transcended species. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the wild dog slowly backed away. He rejoined his pack, which had been unsuccessful in their pursuit of the decoy lions, and the entire group disappeared over the ridge. The crisis had passed without violence, without intervention, and without loss of life. Sahara had somehow communicated to a natural enemy that her cubs were under special protection, and that protection had been respected. As the sun began to set, the pride resumed their journey. The cubs, refreshed by their long rest and successful nursing session, seemed ready for the final push to the river. Marcus and Amara followed at a distance, now more convinced than ever that they were observing something truly special. The pride reached the river just as the last light was fading from the sky. The cubs had their first taste of abundant fresh water, and Sahara was able to drink deeply for the first time in days. The adults began hunting almost immediately, knowing that the cubs would need rich milk to continue growing strong. Marcus realized that his time with this remarkable family had truly come to an end. The cubs were now 3 weeks old, healthy, and fully integrated into a pride that had shown extraordinary adaptability and intelligence. They had survived their birth, their first days of life, and their first major journey. They were ready to face the challenges of growing up wild. As Marcus prepared for his final departure, Sahara once again approached him. This time she brought all 3 cubs with her, carrying them one by one to a spot where Marcus could see them clearly. It was as if she wanted him to have one last look at the lives he had helped save. Simba was now clearly the largest and most adventurous of the 3. Nuru had developed into a thoughtful, observant cub who seemed to learn quickly from everything around her. And Jasiri, despite his small size, had proven himself to be the most determined and resilient of the group. As Marcus watched them playing together by the riverbank, he realized that he had not just saved 3 lion cubs. He had participated in something much larger, the continuation of an ancient lineage, the preservation of wild places, and the demonstration that sometimes, when approached with respect and humility, the boundaries between human and wild can be crossed for the greater good. 6 months later, Marcus received a message from Amara with photos of the 3 cubs now growing into strong young lions. Simba was developing into a confident young male with the beginnings of a mane. Nuru had become one of the most skilled hunters among the younger lions in the pride, and Jasiri, still the smallest of the 3, had earned the respect of the entire pride through his courage and determination. The story of the man who risked everything for a lioness in labor had become legend among the Maasai people, who spoke of it as proof that sometimes the spirits choose certain humans to serve as guardians of the wild. Marcus never claimed any spiritual significance for his actions, but he couldn't deny that the experience had changed him in ways that went far beyond his professional knowledge. Years later, when people asked Marcus why he had taken such enormous risks for 3 lion cubs, his answer was always the same: because in that moment there was no choice to make. There was only life that needed saving, and the knowledge that I could help save it. The 3 cubs lived to adulthood, successfully reproducing and adding their own offspring to the pride. Sahara lived to see her grandchildren born, and the genetic line that Marcus had helped preserve continued to thrive in the wild places of Kenya. But perhaps the most important legacy of that night was not the lives that were saved, but the demonstration that humans and wildlife could coexist in ways that honored both the wildness of nature and the compassion that defines the best of humanity. In a world where such examples are increasingly rare, the story of Sahara and her cubs became a symbol of hope for the future of conservation. Marcus returned to his practice in Colorado, but he carried with him the memory of amber eyes filled with trust, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the most profound rewards. The lioness had taught him that courage comes not from the absence of fear, but from acting in spite of it when life itself hangs in the balance.